papers, all individually examples of, I think, how research should be done with a great deal of concern for empirical detail and basing an argument on that. And I thought in this concluding session that we had, I'm not sure what was intended, but I have decided that perhaps the thing to do is that we've had many papers giving us with many ideas. And if we were to pull them together, because Rajesh has taken the initiative to compel us to think or rethink political publics, then we might as well focus on just that idea. And I will begin by saying that we've had many different notions of the public, let alone publics. And maybe that's a good starting point, and I'd ask the panelists to tell us a little bit about how they think about it. Is public a space? Is public denoting an arena, a domain? Is it a domain of a particular kind of activity and engagement? Engagement directly in determining the affairs which are called political? Is it an arena of merely collective engagement of any kind? Because you can have one kind whipping the other kind. So is it merely a domain of collective engagement, which is creating multitudes? Is it a domain of collective engagement against the hegemon? Is that its primary concern? Who defines the hegemon? Will we define it merely in terms of state? Or will we have to bring in some element of the nature of the market that is there and the economic sphere? Then there is the other question, because of which I suppose people go back to Habermas. Is the public a space or a sphere which is characterized by certain values, let's say the idea of equal persons, citizens as equals, engaged in a discussion with each other? But if these equal individuals, equal citizens are perceived as either individuals, then what is the scope and possibility of a serious engagement in which reason and reasoned arguments can prevail to arrive at a consensus? If it is a domain where individuals are representatives of particular interest and subject positions, then again the same question arises. How are we going to move towards the ideal that Habermas has of a rationally motivated consensus? Alternative, we abandon and give up the notion of consensus. Then what remains? What are we really seeking? Really, multitudes in building solidarities engaged in an endless struggle, which means there will only be power and depends on which side you are on, and people will have calculations accordingly. Is there some reason, and that's what another, is there some argument that we can give in terms of saying, no, we need to see the public not merely in these terms of endless conflict, but also as the reaffirmation and emergence of certain values for which we are fighting and struggling. Then we need to define those values and see how we are going to bring them in and take the idea of the public away from merely a domain, inner, outer, visible, non-visible, voice, no voice, that kind of dichotomy, or from the mere notion of engagement or activity. So I would request all the speakers to give us some idea about that. Then there is the second order of question, because public, and the idea of publics, I suppose, is to say there is not one but many public spheres, which is the critique of Habermas's position that has come to us. And maybe there is more to it than that. But that again leaves us with this question of, are we thinking in terms of, because you have to abandon the idea of consensus for them to accommodate publics, and if that is a more enabling idea. The third question I thought we might all reflect on, it would be nice, at least for me, I think at the end of a full day, it would be nice if we can go back home thinking about, or wherever we are going, thinking about something. And the third thing really is you have qualified the term public with political. What other kinds of publics are we talking about? Is there to be, there was a hint, and in the morning about distinction between political public and social public. What is that distinction? And how do we need that distinction? Are they going to be an economic public, a literary public? I mean, how are we dividing, and what is the purpose of this division for which this becomes a relevant concept? Two methodological issues have also surfaced which I would like to have some ideas about from everybody. And those are one, how do we talk about any concept or idea, like public or political public or publics, etc.? Should it be in terms of the many different usages of these terms in many different contexts by different people? Which means that we have no idea. We will not even perhaps understand each other because there are so many different usages. Or is there some core, some regnant meaning even in this diversity that exists, and then we need to really pick on that and say, well, that's what we have in mind in all of these various cases when we are talking about the political or the public or thinking or whatever it might be. A second methodological issue is there a distinction between narrativizing events, and let us take for granted that no narrativization or description is without the involvement, active involvement of subject and categories of this that the subject brings to bear on the material. But is there still, with all that baggage, a distinction between providing a narrative, descriptive, and ordering that? B, representation of reality, is that a different mode of knowing and description? And a third, argumentation. So with these, I welcome you to this session and hoping to get some enlightened wisdom on this subject. Should I start? Who's starting? Are we drawing the quarter? Professor Budavarti, Ajay Budavarti.
Already set an exhaustive agenda like Modi. We have nothing to say but be silent now. But still I'll venture to say something. That the large number of questions that you raised and also I think that came across in the presentation, I thought one entry point which was sort of latent in many of the presentations but which was not foregrounded was the question of popular culture and populism. I think that's the running theme across these papers, which perhaps were not dealt with as much as perhaps they could have done in terms of understanding the nature of public that is emerging. Especially we are now talking in the context of trumpeted victory of Mr. Trump. I think we have just heard it, and we have all been taken by surprise yet again as we were taken by surprise in 2014. So we, I think academics are eternally surprised lot now. We are only here to be surprised and surprise each other in the conference rooms, but something else is happening all around us and none of our categories seem to be able to catch up with the developments around. So I was wondering if this public has to be recast in terms of our understanding of popular culture. And if popular culture is the template, then we'll have to raise this question that you raised. If there are multiple publics and if there is public and counter-public, are they both being mediated by a certain constructed popular culture that already exists? That they are not as far away as we often pitch them to be. That the idea of the public as a constructed hegemonic field and the counter-publics that have come against this constructed consensus, I don't think we'll no longer have that option of segregating them as binaries as we earlier often did in our academic discourses. It is, I think, being mediated by a popular culture, and that is leading to an increasing overlap of categories, of practices, and also experiential availability of the experiential dimension. To my mind, that's what is constructing the public. The question that we need to really ask, that's perhaps central, which I think got reflected, is that is this popular culture given or is it being contextually constructed? Is there something constructed, structure to this popular culture that's already given? If you read somebody like Alexander, Jeffrey Alexander in The Civil Sphere, he argues that this popular culture or this public is already constructed around certain given binaries, and you can't do very much about it. But what we do with our politics is try and wade through, mediate through those given categories. For instance, he constructed binaries like violence and non-violence. He talks about idea of excitable and calm. So he says that excitable would always lead to more in terms of a collapse of dialogue, where being calm leads to more dialogic traditions. So violence and non-violence. We cannot overtly ever pitch in terms of violence, but we always construct politics as a moral rhetoric towards non-violence. So Jeffrey Alexander makes this point, I think, and we need to, when I first read him, I thought this was like an overstatement, given that already having these binaries constructed, but given the developments around, one gets a sense that there is a popular culture which is already constructed and has a structure out there. And perhaps the right has understood it much better than the rest of us. And they're able to feed in to those images of that constructed popular culture. That's my first point, and that we can debate on this. And that also takes me to the certain very complex issues that emerge in various presentations. I'll pick up 2 or 3 of them in terms of highlighting this point, that how there can be unintended consequences out of some of the things that my colleagues have argued in the morning. For instance, this argument that Shefali makes in terms of online, and I think some of the questions reflected that online presentation or online presence of women is one mode of deconstructing the available patriarchal structures. Sitting at home, she says, you access online, and that's one mode of deconstructing the patriarchal structures, which makes it which is a very loaded and strange argument, which almost tempts me to say that invisibilization is becoming a mode of protest. Because the more invisible you become, we are now reading invisibilization itself as a mode of protest, which at one level collapses the binary between public, private, and so on and so forth. And a large range of, I think, recent interventions have taken this, and this is becoming increasingly commonsensical. Is, for instance, this whole new movie, I think, Lipstick Under Burqa, I'm waiting to watch it. I don't know it's as yet available. The language of, we are talking about the rights of sex workers, which we almost do not have a political language now to intervene into that kind of a political discourse. 20 years back, we did that when we were talking of Gandhi. The Gandhian strategy on the women's question was precisely this, that Gandhi politicized and brought women without challenging their location in the family. For instance, when he was talking of the Khadi foreign cloth boycott, he said that this movement cannot succeed without women participating in big numbers, because women are the ones who decide at home who wears what. So and the critique was precisely this, that Gandhi was politicizing the women's position without really challenging her location in the familial structure. But somehow that language seems to be unavailable to us today. We seem to be increasingly talking in terms of collapsing that binary. This could be under the constraint of popular culture. And what is interesting here is that increasingly as the public is getting subalternized, this kind of a language of invisibility is emerging, which is a kind of a very strange parallel that is emerging. That increasingly as the public is becoming subalternized, the language of invisibility is becoming common sense to many of us. That we are not going back to questioning the old kind of questions, which is also, I think, was also in a sense available in Harish's presentation. And 2 points that I can pick up in Harish's presentation is precisely this, that his questioning of another kind of fluidity that he brings in, the collapsing old kinds of distinctions which he talks are mostly based on either conservative Brahmins or left liberal Brahmins like myself and Gopal Guru. I think both of us have that tradition. I think you belong to that tradition, that you are a left liberal Brahmin, I'm categorizing you. In the available new Dalit identity politics, that's where you belong with me. So with this new move that Harish's presentation, I think, is a classical example of this, of how you collapse these binaries under the stress of popular culture. This politics of visibility that you're talking about, the politics of presence, you say gives the template for Dalits to push ahead, and cutting across the old kind of binaries, which on one hand, well, is an attractive and interesting argument, but there's a huge flip side to that, which raises a whole range of questions to us. For instance, the demand that some Dalit scholars have made that Dalits should be the chief priest in Tirupati. This is a very, very new kind of a demand that Dalits have put forward. Or for instance, the opposite side of that is that after post Rohit Vemula's case, those who have come to defend ABVP on much of TV channels, I've watched many of Telugu TV channels, were all Dalits. And they were the ones who were defending ABVP and saying that Tony Vedmal was not a Dalit, or that was a conspiracy of the left, or it was a struggle between OBC. And what do you do with this kind of a presence? That I think popular culture pushes us this kind of new questions where you seem to be generating a sense of common symbolism between the high and the low culture. Why is it that increasingly, as we are observing subordination of public, we are moving towards the right? And this, I think, also raises a whole range of new questions for the post-colonial theory, for used cultures, of rumor, and which also you have, I think, in your presentation said that Dalit, in this new political subject of Dalit, would mimic, would manipulate, would have lies, and this is to circumvent the existing structures, which is a fair reading, which is again, I think, much goes to the kind of a post-colonial kind of a reading. But it is the same kind of strategies that the right is also using. Morph videos, false propaganda, nothing to do with evidence. The more the noise you create, more sense of presence in the public. How do you then study this commonality of these strategies, which seem to be becoming prolific all around? And Trump, I think, is the final point. 2 minutes. Okay. So since I have only 2 minutes with Professor Mahajan, I cannot take chances. Anybody else I would have extended it. What I would do is to conclude by arguing that I know that Rajesh always does this mischief. Whenever I speak, he puts toothpick in the chair. So, is this unavailability of political language for the rest of us? I think even in Anuj's presentation, he talked about the PIL. But what was perhaps missing was an entire shift in the, as you said, there's a centrality of law, you said, but actually it's also undermining of the legal objectivity. There's a tremendous shift in the emphasis from investigation to demonstrative effect, something like a Batla House encounter, something like a Bhopal encounter. We are talking in terms of that old civil liberties language of rights, evidence, rule of law being violated, so on and so forth, but that doesn't seem to make sense to majority. I mean, you're shocked to see the way people are celebrating Bhopal encounter. How would, I mean, and our category is the language that we use. So there is again this parallel double movement, as Polanyi would say, that as the centrality of law, there is also undermining of the efficacy or the volatility of the law itself. That you are moving from evidence-based. Today evidence and facts are just don't matter. You are going from evidence to intention. What matters is intention. So when you talk to at a popular level people about Bhopal encounter, and you said after all these were not convicts, these were under trials, it's possible that they were not terrorists, people have concluded. They said that but their intention was that of terrorism. And therefore it's justified that they be killed this way. How do you intervene in that discourse? I think our political language does not have a purchase to sort of cut across that kind of a popular culture that is being built. Similarly, that Modi's recent announcement of doing a black money and doing it with this 500, 1,000, that's a tremendous purchase. I've got half a dozen calls in the morning that look, you're critical of Modi, but look how effective he is. Yeah. And the way he has announced it, Anupama was narrating in the morning, he said, "Ab 500 और 1000 के नोट, अब सिर्फ कागज के बराबर है." The effect of this one sentence, I think, is equal to 1,000 seminars in JNU. We would never be able to create that kind of an impact. A simple statement of this kind, narrated in the Gabbar Singh kind of a style, has a tremendous purchase at the level of popular culture. I think our categories and discourse have become too sanitized, and the questions that we are asking in terms of public, counter-public, we have moved beyond Habermasian kind of a consensus-oriented public. But that I think we need to move further beyond that. And the most worrying part of it, and that's where I think the post-colonial theory will come under much stress, is that increasing subordination of public is producing this kind of a popular culture. And those strategies that we thought were part of the subaltern culture, whether it's rumor, whether it's oral, whether questioning objectivity, scientificity, so on and so forth, has moved heavily towards the right and seems to be unavailable to us, those of us sitting on the other side of the fence. I think this one entry point perhaps should make us rethink how else to sort of conceptualize thought. Let's stop here. Otherwise, Gurpreet will make me part of the private.
Thank you. I'm only following Professor Gopal's model example as a chair in the morning. I think two issues have emerged, separate, but two are, so to say. There seems to be, I think, one suggestion raised which we need to think about and consider and challenge is representation of large numbers of people, referring to what you're calling popular culture, but really popular imagination, not being captured by theoretical language or academic discourse, and sometimes equivalent of academic discourse is something called left liberal or whatever. The second issue that has emerged, and I think that we need to consider, is this realization has dawned at a moment when, of course, as you said rightly, we have just heard what has happened in terms of electoral results in America and will probably happen elsewhere. Is it the case that because there is a certain kind of language which is now has a little purchase, we start thinking of theoretical languages falling out of use? Or should we, what would have happened had the result been different? Would that language have got legitimized? So there is that second kind of challenge that we need to think about. Third, there is a big danger, and I think he has alerted us to that, what is the purpose of political theory if it cannot really address real life issues and speak to people? That's a very big and important question. But we need also to put along with it the other question, and that is politics about representing what happens and exists, or is it also a vision about what might be? Okay? So, who's next? Sudhir. Professor Sudhir Suthar, please.
Thank you. Thanks, Rajarshi, for the opportunity, and thanks, Gurpreet. I would like to begin with a question which came up in the last session, and a presentation, and remarks which came from the previous chair. The question which was asked about an undeclared emergency in India, and the presentation in response to which this question was raised about the legal activism in post-emergency India. Now, the way I look at it, I would like to start from there. I think the discourse on understanding political publics since morning appears to assume that there are certain spontaneous moments, there are certain ruptures, and suddenly a new kind of public emerges which we need to capture, which we need to understand, because it provides a new phenomena to our understanding of the political. I think there is we need to be cautious about this, because to my mind public is a continuous phenomena as well. Of course, we cannot deny ruptures and we cannot deny changes, we cannot deny some kinds of moments when we see a different kind of movement or a different kind of public or publics emerging, but there are continuities as well. And here I would like to bring the answer which came in response to the undeclared emergency. That is that we tend to sort of ignore that India has been the country where the maximum number of journalists have been murdered in the last 1 decade, which has not been a part of the mainstream discourse on the civil liberties in India. So I think we need to understand this complexity as well, that whether we are actually ignoring some of the continuities which have been there, and we are thinking that there is a change which has taken place in a recent past, and we like to start from there. So I think the continuity and change phenomena has to be brought in while understanding the idea of political public. That is one. Second is, I think it appears as if public is the phenomena of political public is an independent process, where it starts from a moment, it continues for a long time, and we still do not know where is it heading towards. In order to understand this phenomena better, for example, in case of the online public and its impact on women, or the question of Dalits and social obligation, it would be useful for us if we look at the other crucial variables which has an impact upon this process of creation, recreation, emergence or re-emergence or disappearance of publics. Now, for instance, I am referring here to the role of the state. And here I would also like to bring in a comparative perspective. For instance, if we look at the phenomena of managed democracies in the countries which emerged after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and I would also like to categorize the present Indian political dispensation in that category of a managed democracy, where the state plays a crucial role in creating a certain kind of public. And it not only creates a certain kind of public, but it also controls the manner in which this public will behave. And this process becomes really interesting, because when we are looking at the phenomena of public as an independent process, somewhere it is actually a controlled experiment. I would just like to give an example which comes from some of my own work. For instance, the creation of the Agricultural Products Marketing Committees in India, what is called the APMCs. Now, APMCs created a kind of zone where different economic classes from the rural or semi-urban setup will come and buy agricultural products and will supply it to other parts of the country or globe. Now, this resulted into creation of a new kind of political class which will negotiate with the state, which will also negotiate with the petty producers or farmers or big landlords, and gradually this newer class which emerged through APMC, some of those are like Artiyas or agricultural brokers, or some of them even created many lobbies, some of them are in politics now, people like Sharad Pawar or many farmers like Mahendra Singh Tikait and many others. Of course, they were not part of the APMC, but they played a very crucial role in determining the nature of policies regarding rural India or regarding the agriculture sector. Now, this sector which I am referring to, the new capitalists in India, they emerged in a very controlled manner. And when we look at this process, we would see that they are ready to negotiate with the state on certain terms and conditions, but if we look at their position vis-a-vis state policies, we find that it is difficult to categorize them in the other categories of publics, for example, the category of Dalit, or the category of women, online public and women categories of public sphere. So, how state deliberately creates a kind of public, controls it, allows it to function to some extent, and is in a capacity to stop it whenever it is willing to. And this phenomena is very much visible in case of, for example, in case of Russia, where it is the state which will create a certain kind of public through certain policies, welfare policies, allow people to function, but even at the same time controls their nature of function. So I think we need to understand the role of state, or maybe many other variables in this process. Now, the third point which I think I have to mention is that it also appears that in the discourse on political publics, it has largely become an urban-centric phenomena. The phenomena of public takes place in an urban or maybe largely in a semi-urban setup, and then gradually becomes a popular movement. What about the rural? It appears that it has taken a back seat. It doesn't really figure in the category of publics because if we look at it in a classical Marxian explanation, that because they lack the capacity to express themselves, the subaltern view, or they do not have a political agency to express their own grievances, therefore they need some elite person, some educated elite coming from the urban setup and giving them a voice? Or do they have certain kinds of voices, but somehow the discourse on political public fails to capture that kind of political voice? And if we look at rural India, of course it has undergone a transformation, and it is really interesting to understand the way public sphere, or maybe some may call it common spaces, in rural India have gradually disappeared. They have not only undergone a serious transformation, but they have almost disappeared. Dipankar Gupta's famous theorization about disappearing ruralities explains this phenomena. And the way anthropologists like Vasavi has explained that how traditional festivals or many such occasions have gradually disappeared with the gradual penetration of urban culture and the emergence of neoliberal economy. But is it only about disappearance? Has rural India only witnessed the transformation towards disappearing the traditionally existing common spaces or publics, or it has also given way to emergence of new kinds of publics? Now, I believe we have failed to understand that complexity. For instance, if we look at Kerala or in many other parts of the country where groups of many people from different rural areas are coming together trying to create different kinds of arts, or also trying to create common kinds of land where they cultivate together, they sit together, they talk, they discuss. And this is also an effort to say no to the model of green revolution, which actually said that technology can take care of the agriculture sector. So there is an alternative public which is not only challenging the, I won't even take 2 minutes, less than that. There is a new kind of public which is not only challenging the political idea but also economic and the technological aspects attached to the idea of green revolution, which has become a dominant part of our thinking. So I think we need to problematize the idea of political publics in contemporary times, and we need to move beyond the traditional understanding and also to capture some of the newer phenomena which are emerging at the margin, especially in the countryside, and also have to look at it in a comparative perspective. Thank you.
Eventually, and has come to agree with Ajay simply because they're sitting together. And it is because he thought that this vocabulary of private and public, Ajay thought that, is just insufficient really for the present. And now he has introduced a category that the public is being created and constructed by the state. So maybe we need a new vocabulary. I would love somebody.
Amir will give us that.
Professor Amir Ali.
Who's the chair? I don't understand.
Professor Guru.
Yeah,
Okay.
please.
क्या रहा बाकी का? Okay, let me begin with the idea of the political public. Now, I think the experience in the 20th century has configured the public in a certain way. The extension of the franchise, the particular way in which larger and larger numbers of people have come to participate in the political process, has given us a certain configuration of the political public. Now, that's the first observation that I want to make on the basis of what you said. And I hope I don't start agreeing with the two of you. Because I've been given this daunting task of coining a new vocabulary. So, essentially that was my first observation. Let me make a second observation, which is that the quality of this democratic political public has been subject to a great deal of decline. There's been a certain degeneration. Now, I would attribute this degeneration to, in the late 20th century, the onset of economic neoliberalism, where as a result of significant cutbacks in public expenditure, there has been a reduction in the investment on the public in terms of education, in terms of health, in terms of housing. So the point that I'm trying to make is that there has been a significant decline in the quality of this political public, as a result of which, some of the earlier speakers today were talking about the fact that only 50% of the electorate decides to vote. Even when they decide to vote, it's not a very informed decision. So in the Brexit vote, for instance, people were voting on the basis of whim and caprice. The BBC had put out a fact checker, so you could actually check the claims that were being made, especially by the Leave campaign. But people were not willing to do that. Now, the fact that a lot of people decide to participate in the political process on the basis of what I'm referring to as whim and caprice is a reflection of this decline in the quality of the political public. Okay. Now, let me move on, because broadly the point that I'm trying to make here is that the reason why we have got to where we are today, on this very day, it's what, 9th of November? With all of this news trickling in about a certain gentleman called Donald Trump winning handsomely. We still use polite language. For how long, I don't know. But, this particular election victory needs to be understood in a certain context. I'm looking at 3 electoral verdicts. Okay, I'm looking at this one, I'm looking at the Brexit campaign, I'm looking at the Modi victory in India in 2014. Now, I have more things to say about the Modi victory a little later, but let me just combine the US and the UK events because they happened in the same year and they've come as a bit of a shocker. It's interesting to see that in many ways this is a protest vote. The vote for Trump, the fact that Hillary Clinton could not win, the fact that we've been denied the first woman president of the US after the first black man to occupy the White House is significant. Now, why is it significant? It's significant because Hillary Clinton was considered to be a dyed-in-the-wool establishment figure. There's a certain disenchantment that electorates are now beginning to express towards the political establishment. The large numbers of people who voted for Mr. Trump are from the American Rust Belt, the deindustrialized America. The point that I was making about lower and lower public investment, the point about the deliberate deindustrialization that has been carried out in advanced Western democracies. This deliberate deindustrialization, the deliberate underinvestment in the public, has resulted in the kind of, the degeneration of the engagement of the public with the political process. In the Brexit campaign, again, it was Northern England specifically, okay, the deindustrialized heartland. Once the cradle of the fabled industrial revolution, deliberately deindustrialized during the Thatcher years. We need to understand that this is the reason why things like this are happening. Okay, now interestingly, a point that Professor Bhattacharya was making in the morning, I don't know if he's here today, but the great failure of the left has been that the discontent against globalization that the left could not articulate has been captured in the popular imagination by the right. This is something for us to really think about. Where are we? Why have we reached this kind of a situation? Okay. Now this brings me to the responsibility of political theory. Now I'm urging a sense of urgency now, today. I'm urging a sense of urgency because we need to understand the point that Ajay was raising. What is the role of political theory? Now let me be a little kind of nasty to my own tribe because I can do it because I consider myself a political theorist. Professor Mahajan might have differences.
Do you accept us as political theorists?
Another seminar.
Right. But quite often when I've talked to students, the imagery that I've put across of political theorists is like a pujari. Okay? We have a pantheon of gods. Democracy, civil society, equality. You see, this whole range of gods. And as political theorists, we have latched onto one of these concepts. And we've regularly paid our, worshipped them and paid obeisance to them. I think it's time we stop that. Because one of the great failures has been precisely in terms of democracy. I think there's been a self-congratulatory mode when we've talked about democracy, especially in this country. We've talked about the great success of democracy in India. So, as political theorists, as pondering over and reflecting over what is the role of political theory, we need to understand the vocabulary that was given the responsibility of recoining. We need, I think, perhaps to get over this particular way of doing political theory. Okay, it's important to be far more critical of the resources that we use. And I think the most important to begin with would be democracy itself. Because what we have seen is that one of democracy's offerings has come in the form, I won't call him a gentleman this time, but this individual, Mr. Trump. Now what is this going to result in? Okay, it's difficult to say what this is going to result in. But there will be a greater and greater venom in the public domain. You can be sure about that. What is now going to happen is that there's a certain kind of a nastiness, a certain fascism within all of us. Okay, and there's a potential fascism within all of us. I was just discussing this with some of my students yesterday. We talked about Wilhelm Reich's book, The Mass Psychology of Fascism.
Foucault says this.
It's,
Fascism
within us, but right, I'm drawing from Reich here.
Adorno.
Okay, and this has been precipitated by the rise of figures of this particular kind. Okay, so the point that I'm really trying to emphasize here is that we need to understand that this is the result of democracy itself, not in the way that, since you mentioned Adorno, the way we looked about developments in Germany as being the result of the Enlightenment itself. Okay, we perhaps need to look at democracy as bringing us to this sorry state of affairs, and then how do we then reconceptualize democracy? Now, keeping in mind the fact that I'll have to be very particular with time sitting next to Professor Mahajan.
Neither needs time.
Right. The book, the reason why, a little while ago I said I'm stressing this with a certain sense of urgency.
A book that I have been reading with a certain interest of late, which I've shared with some of my students, is a book on German universities in Nazi Germany. It's called Nazi Germany and the Humanities. The remarkable thing, and the reason I'm reading this course is what is happening to public universities in India and JNU in particular. Now the reason I'm reading this particular book is, I was astounded to know that the humanities gave themselves up to the onslaught of Nazi Germany. They did not resist. Heidelberg University, one of the more prominent universities, offered itself up. There was a silence among the academia when many Jewish professors were dismissed from their academic positions. I hope I'm wrong, but I see something of this kind happening in this country. And I would again stress this particular, liberal silences. Okay? The language of liberalism is not working. It's not being able to evoke the particular crisis that we have now reached. There is a certain superficiality at which the liberal discourse operates. It's important to be able to break through that superficiality. And what I'm trying to suggest by invoking the 1930s is that if you look at what is happening, we are perhaps reliving a form of the 1930s, perhaps in a much worse form. Why is this happening? It's happening because there's a certain crisis within the globe, a systemic crisis in the global order. We've had 4 decades of neoliberalism. If you read someone like Martin Jacques, who was one of the first people to very articulately talk about what neoliberalism as a phenomenon is all about, neoliberalism is reaching a certain termination point. Now, as people on the left, many fellow travelers on the left, many of us need to think about what could possibly come after this. Because what neoliberalism has done is to render democracy into the sterility of a market democracy, where democracy merely becomes a form of revealed preference, where you basically use your vote to express your preference for a particular brand of leader. So the 2014 elections was a typical example of this, of how the election campaign is reduced to the superficiality of an advertising campaign. Okay? So the broader point that I'm now trying to make here is when I kind of picked up democracy for kind of targeting it and suggesting that we really need to rethink it, is that the 4 decades of the operation of neoliberalism has, as a result of this, democracy has replicated and within itself and mirrored the logic of the market. It's precisely because of that you have a phenomenon like Trump in the US. It's precisely because of this that you have a Brexit vote in the UK. It's precisely because of this that you have Mr. Modi in India. Okay? But there's a difference here. The difference here is that in the case of the US and the UK, it's a protest against globalization. We are still in the process of falling in love with globalization. We are in the phase of hyper-globalization. How long that will last is anyone's guess, but I'll stop here.
Thank you, Amir, for a very interesting new vocabulary.
I did it.
It seems, yes, living up to the promise. It seems now the political theorists are not just pujaris, we are Hindu pujaris. You can worship your own God. So somebody, you rightly say, latches on to democracy and civil society and public sphere. Perhaps the fault is that we are thinking of democracy only in terms of participation. And hopefully Rajesh will correct me that we can bring in democracy as a constellation of concepts linked to the idea, perhaps, and that's what we might want to retrieve. To other ideas about the nature of the public that is being constructed or that we are creating for ourselves, but a lot of interesting ideas. One methodological issue, and I can't, because reality is so messy. Every time we have an example, we can think of a counter-example immediately. So what is the larger theorization that we want to hang on to? What is, and that issue is in terms of what are we investing, what are we expecting education to do? When the right wing was resurgent in India, we said it's captured the middle class imagination, the educated people. And now it is the absence of that which appears to be, similarly for globalization, we are enchanted, they are disenchanted, yielding same result. So I think we need now also to push ourselves further because we can get reality just so messy. What are we going to push for and in what way? All yours, Rajoshi, because Professor Rajoshi Dasgupta, because he conceived and thought, so we will have his imagination and then subjected to collective scrutiny. Yeah, Professor Dasgupta.
Thank you, Gurpreet and everybody for making this an absolutely fascinating day of a range of very, very rich and provocative papers, comments, interventions, and now the session of, where we have colleagues intervening and giving their thoughts on the questions. Professor Mahajan has, made in some sense the task easier for us by laying out a range of questions to which we can react, to which we can respond. And I'm not going to try and respond to all the questions she has asked. Some of these are, I suspect, meant to be mulled over for a longer period of time than give a knee-jerk response at some level. For example, the question of narrative representation and argument, I think, needs larger thinking on my part, certainly. But let me partly react to what my colleagues are saying and partly respond to the questions raised by Professor Mahajan, and try to give a sense of, what were the ideas behind trying to put together a seminar such as this. I would begin, kind of just by way of clarifying 2 points made by one by Ajay and one by Suti, among other points. Just to clarify, one is that I think it might be actually more productive to think of public and even public culture as different from popular culture. There is a danger of conflating the two. There is a way in which popular refers to a certain constituency and a certain particular constituency which public does not. Public is a term that goes to universality, that goes to generality, and that speaks about bringing in others within its frame, apart from various. And we know that when we say public, we mean actors, we mean spaces, we mean acts and various things. For instance, and this is by way of a very brief reaction to Sudhi, thank you for making the point that we haven't been able to think about the agrarian space, for instance, or the actors in the agrarian field, for instance. But what is quite remarkable is that those of us who are interested in, let us say, questions of urbanization and urbanism are coming around to rediscovering the rural very much inside the urban. We are, not only looking at, let us say, entities like Monica villages, but we are looking at practices, professions, solidarities, ties, kinship networks, which are very, very rural in character. So maybe even calling them urban is a bit of a mistake, and we have to rethink these categories rather than thinking of these two as two ends of a spectrum. Now, what is there to rethink in what we were trying to engage with today? I think to begin with, we are looking at 3 things for making things simple. One is a set of new actors, and we heard about a range of new actors today. We heard about footpath dwellers, hawkers, we heard about lawyers, advocates, we heard about various segments of Dalits, activists, and those who are not given to activism. We've heard of animal-like human beings being part of the public. We also heard about how sacred animals are becoming, in some sense, consequential to what happens in the public. So it immediately opens up, the figures that we think, in some sense, who inhabit the public, who make up the public, in some sense, and not just think of them as vague, amorphous sort of categories, but in very specific terms. We have also come across a range of new spaces, and I think that is very important to keep in mind. We are thinking of infrastructures, we are thinking of courtrooms, we are thinking of streets, we are thinking of public squares. I also gave an example of the Azadi Chowk in JNU in the morning. We are also, of course, looking at online spaces. These are very new kind of, conceptually, streets have of course been there. Politics have taken place in the streets, but the fact that politics is taking place on the streets may not have been thought about very, very closely in older forms of analysis. Or the fact that there is a phenomena like that of occupying certain public spaces, certain public squares. The range of movements we have seen over the last 2-3 years from the Arab Spring onwards throw up a very different kind of a phenomena that needs us to think with regard to categories of space and what happens to space when the public produce these spaces in a very new way, transform the character of these spaces entirely. And we have also, by extension looked at a range of new acts. For example, the acts of occupying a space, newer acts of deliberating, discoursing, debating, speech acts, and of course tragically acts like that of suicide, as Harish reminded us in the morning. Now, how do we think about these actors, these spaces and these acts, and what light do they sort of shed on how we think about the question of public? Now, the way I would like to come to it, and this is something that I very briefly tried to outline in the morning, when most of you hadn't come around. Let me just repeat a few points from what I was saying. I am coming to this to make matters simple, I would say largely taking off from the philosopher Hannah Arendt, whereby the notion of public immediately signals to me a dimension of civic engagement. As I said in the morning, that Arendt makes some very important departures from classical Marxist understanding about these issues. One, Arendt makes a distinction between the social and the public, unlike Marx. And two, Arendt makes a further distinction between labor, work and action, again unlike Marx. And for Arendt, it is this domain of action that relates to the dimension of civic engagement. And this is where, for Arendt, the idea of public comes in. Why is that so? And Arendt is particularly very seriously worried about the question of public. I would say somewhere sharing a mode that Amir was sort of speaking in just a while back, which is thinking about the question of public, the question of democracy, with totalitarianism in mind, with the threat of totalitarianism looming large. And this, I think, made her take a certain departure not only from Marx but from the Habermasian tradition of thinking about public. And this is to respond to some of the questions you were putting forth. That yes, and therefore I think following Arendt, I would like to begin to think of making a sort of departure from the idea of public in single and public as primarily a site of consensus. Because one of the things that insights that Hannah Arendt shares with us is that there is, if we are to think the question of the public in a manner where it can become associated with the realization of freedom, then such a freedom can only rest in a certain kind of pluralism. The simple issue of when I am putting forth my reason before all of you, I am putting it forth subject to scrutiny by everybody and the perspectives that all of you share. And there is something desirable about submitting to this plurality of viewpoints. There is something democratic, there is something free about committing this particular kind of a gesture. Now this brings me to the last point, which is the way in which Arendt makes a very subtle but important distinction in terms of who is the public. And I will just rest my comments with that distinction. I think it bears a lot, it sheds a lot of light on what we have been discussing. And it's a very interesting sort of a contrast between when we are speaking as teachers, for instance, or when we are speaking as students, for instance, and when I am speaking as a Bengali, for instance, or as an upper caste person, for instance, so on and so forth. What is coming to light is what I am and not who I am. For Arendt, the who in us comes out, leaps into the light when we actually step into the public and make a certain speech act or undertake a certain action. It's only by dint of that kind of speech act and action that we become a who in a sense, which makes us the member of a public in the manner in which Arendt helps us to imagine. And to my mind, what Arendt has in mind here when she speaks in favor of such acts, and this is the value that at least I am trying to push towards, is that such acts are what make possible for a certain space to become such that freedom can actually take shape, that the exercise of freedom can actually become visible and take on an appearance. Okay. Once again, I would want to kind of again recall what was happening at the Freedom Square over the entire last semester. We could use that as an example of such a site. But the most important point I believe she is making, and I'm going to conclude with that, is that such acts, when they are enacted, they make freedom appear. But once these acts come to an end, the space also loses its character in that sense. And therefore, it leaves us with a larger responsibility of constituting what Arendt calls a community of memory. That it is by constituting a community of memory of deeds and acts which made freedom appear, that we can make sure that those acts remain as memories to inspire others, around us and others to come in the future. And this, for Arendt, becomes the moment of realization of what she sees as the old Greek tradition of polis. Polis meaning the city-state. This is what she sees as the core wisdom of the polis. Now we can have differences, of course, about that, but this is by and large the imaginary that I had in mind, and this is the reason why I said public in the plural.
I'm glad we began with Habermas and ended talking about Hannah Arendt. And the startling thing there really is this very interesting idea of freedom and action. Because when I just get up in the morning and dress up to come to work, I'm engaged in doing something. But that's not the action, obviously, she's interested in. And the other dilemma is that you may have seen what I have done, keeping Hannah Arendt in mind. That when freedom is the central category, you can do anything. I have appropriated so much time for myself and not given the panelists enough time. So freedom is this double-edged element. And then freedom only becomes meaningful when I can attribute to myself some sense of responsibility. What kind of political action and contested political action, because it's agonal politics, it's endless, will be there and imagined with responsibility, and responsibility to what? Of course, the tradition is that such deep thoughts require further discussion and a lot of questions, but time is finite. And we should respect that. My personal feeling is that seminars are an occasion when we are enriched by a variety of ideas which we should think about deeply. And all through the day, and I think what a great last session, because we've had so many wonderful ideas that have come our way. And if one of the things, I'll only say this, and I want to speak after this, and maybe have, if you like, one or two questions or anything that the panelists I thought might want to say for themselves again. That one of the things that one learns from and thinks about or values democracy for is that it makes you recognize that things may not go your way. But then it also gives us hope that there will be another day. And I think this is what democracy is all about, in a manner of speaking. After Hannah Arendt, what do you expect? Yeah, only Chantal Mouffe. So I think that could be, but I can understand that this is very difficult when, as he says, I think so evocatively, when the pantheon of gods fail you, and we don't realize that, and we need to recognize how they fail us, when we need to interrogate what we are doing and why, or we need to rethink this state which we have not brought into the picture when we are talking about the public, or think in terms of new ways of configuring our lives and intervening and making ourselves relevant politically. That's what we need. So many great ideas to think about. I can of course now retreat and be silent for many hours and think about this, but if everyone else or somebody would like very urgently to add new ideas, we can certainly take them on, but time is finite. Thinking is an ongoing process, and we should give some due respect to that too. But any urgent questions, interventions, thoughts you want to leave us with?